resume. They may, maybe have a 2-week Python class and you put in that you're Python and somebody is a master developer. You can't tell those differentiation. So like resumes are bad. The same is like with the job interviews. Actually, they're not very good either because some people are very confident and they sort of project competence with that. And then they start the job. You're like, wow, they're really not good at this. They're just good talking about it, right? So we use these flawed systems. So I actually think we need to think about like, how can we hire more holistically? What other, can we actually do assessments that, the highest prediction is actually, I mean, it's be no surprise to anyone, is for somebody to do the job, to assess. Are they going to be good at the job, right? Like that's usually not doable for most companies. You're not going to hire 100 people for 3 months and then lay off 99, right? But like, can we build like maybe virtual reality assessments or something that looks at the core competencies of the job and test for that? But it's really, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to test for soft skills, almost impossible, right? If you could crack that, it's $1 billion assessment industry, you would hit the jackpot. So, but we need to, hire better. Some cynics, employment lawyers told me, what would be more fair? Just ran a random number generator. That is actually more fair. Everyone has the same chance to be chosen, and it's as good as any of these tools.
That does not bode well.
Don't want to do that. No.
Can you hold on for a second, Professor? Yeah. Because I just want to, before we run out of time, I just want to get the voices of our listeners in here once again, because they really supplied us with so many actual first-person experiences. Here's Kyler from Independence, Oregon.
I've found that when I am making a resume or a cover letter, it's almost as bad enough that I have to copy and paste from the job description itself, or I'm not even considered for even an interview in some cases.
All right, and here's Jason from Salinas, California. He actually serves on multiple hiring committees for his college employer, and he's noticed recently, as we've been talking about, an upward trend of applications that are crafted with AI, but Jason says they're all pretty bad.
It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's obvious that it was AI generated to the point that it is almost like students of mine copy and pasting and getting caught in terms of doing plagiarism, and it gets candidates booted. So it's a word to the wise that if you're going to use AI to try to get a job, use it in such a way to where you mask that it's AI, because it's still not to the point where you can just give it a prompt, ask it, and it's 100% going to come across as genuine, particularly in the job application process.
So, Professor Shulman, I have to say, I want to continue to remind myself of the advantages that AI can bring, right? We talked about the volume problem. And ideally, one of the promises of AI is that if care is taken, it should reduce the biases that can come with human-driven processes, right? Because no one's ever said that a face-to-face interview between two people is free of bias, right? We have our own biases there.
Totally. Yes.
But at the same time, like, we're still, maybe in a couple of more generations, we'll get there. But what you were saying a little bit earlier just made me think that, like, ultimately the problem isn't AI, the problem isn't people, the problem is just like how hard it is to find the right people. It's the hiring process in general.
Exactly.
You solve that though, and you have a quadrillion-dollar product.
Totally. And I think it just, like the move to AI or to digitization just has shown us how flawed the system really was always. And and we know that from the data, right? We know that, like, I think within a year and a half, almost 50% of people quit. A lot of people complain, that's not the right hire, yada, yada, yada. It is just incredible hard to hire the right people. And often it's like, when they start the job and they're in the job, you sort of finally get to assess how good they are at the job, right? It is incredibly difficult. And also, like, there's so many untrained folks, right? Like, I mean, lots of people have to hire. They've never been trained for it. It's really difficult.
Yeah. And my conclusion to that is maybe that's the way it should be, right? Maybe some processes shouldn't be easy, and then for some processes, this this Shangri-La of a frictionless process just simply will never happen. We're talking about people at the end of the day. Maybe that's how it should be. But we have only about a minute left, Professor Shulman. And once again, I'm thinking about all the people listening who are particularly still looking for jobs in this fraught new environment. What advice would you give them Are there specific tools you would recommend?
First of all, it's like, I always tell that to every job seeker. It is not you. It is a numbers game, right? It's not that you're not qualified. It's just like, and everyone knows that. Like I talk to the big job platforms. They know that it takes hundreds, thousands of applications for anyone to find a job. So it's not you. Just keep doing it, chugging along. Look at all like the stuff that we see out there, like how to produce a machine readable resume. So I think, like old school, we would tell people like, try to stand out. That's like a human thing to say, like have 2 columns, colors, images, none of that. Machines can't read that. Have short, quantifiable sentences, all of that. I have and find me on LinkedIn. I have a lot of tips on there that I think works for most of the systems, right? I don't actually know which system works every time, but we know a little bit how things work. So don't give up. And we will have to change the system eventually. So
yeah.
Yes.
Well, if you're looking for Professor Shellman on LinkedIn, it's Hilka Shellman, Schellman. You invited that, Professor.
Yes. And there's only one of me. You will find me.
And her book is The Algorithm, How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back. Professor Shellman, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. Still not a bot. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from Seed. Seed's DSO1 is a 24-strain, 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic engineered to survive digestion, support healthy regularity, and promote whole body health. Learn more at seed.com/public. And MathWorks, creator of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham. It's Friday, the end of the week, and almost noon. Time for Week in Review. Filling in for Bill Ratke, here's Gabriel Spitzer with a preview of today's show.
Hey, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, we're going to be rounding up today's, the week's big stories, which include a new state budget in Washington and what it has taught us about the protean figure who sits in our governor's mansion. Immigration enforcement has been a lot more visible lately, and this week a couple of incidents in the Seattle area seemed to escalate things even further. We're going to talk about why that's important. And maybe most importantly, we will dig deep into our jaded, hardened hearts and find something that made us smile this week. I will be joined by 3 very clever panelists on this week's Week in Review, coming up in just a minute or two here on KUOW.
KUOW would like to recognize members of the community who included a gift to this station in their will. You are hearing programming today thanks to the generosity of Leslie Hazelton, Joanne Yort, Tony Krupski, Dr. Michael Len, Estella Berger-Leopold, Billie Jean Matthews, Pat Reese, Eugene and Helen Schmieden, Cheryl Schneider, David Tagliani, Vivian Van de Beesen, Norma Wells, and others who left a legacy with KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Amazon, partnering with nonprofits like the Seattle Chinatown Preservation and Development Authority to help fund and preserve over 9,900 affordable homes across the Puget Sound since 2021. More at aboutamazon.com.
Hey, I'm Ton Vin, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW. On the latest episode of the show, celebrity chef Roy Choi talks about his relationship with food and how to eat healthier without going to extremes. Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's been 5 years since a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd.
This looks like we're still stuck in a rut. We're not doing anything to try to fix some of the issues. I don't see that being a good thing, especially 5 years later.
I'm Ari Shapiro. How the community of South Minneapolis is reckoning with its past and future on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Coming up this afternoon at 3 o'clock here at 94.9 KUOW. Time for news headlines. It's 12:01.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. President Trump's showing no signs of budging on his threat to raise tariffs on the European Union.
I'm not looking for a deal. I mean, we've set the deal. It's at 50%.
Trump speaking at the White House moments ago on his demands on the EU. NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben has more details.
President Trump wrote that trade discussions with the EU were going nowhere. He added that therefore, quote, I am recommending a straight 50% tariff on the European Union starting on June 1st, 2025. As the president has previously imposed tariffs via executive actions, it is unclear what he meant when he said he was recommending new tariffs. In early April, Trump announced 20% tariffs on EU goods as part of a wave of higher tariffs on most countries. He later pulled those back, and the EU rate currently stands at 10%.
NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben. Trump's also threatening a 25% tariff on Apple if it does not make its smartphones in the United States. And he says Apple's not alone.
It would be more. It would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. So anybody that makes that product, and that'll start on, I guess, the end of June. It'll come out. I think we have that appropriately done by the end of June. So if they make that product. Now, again, when they build their plant here, there's no tariff.
Well, critics say the tariffs could cause smartphone prices to be unaffordable for many users. The administration has held a fifth round of talks with Iran to try to block Iran's pathway to a nuclear bomb. Oman, which is mediating, reported some but not conclusive progress. NPR's Michelle Kellerman reports that the diplomacy takes place against the backdrop of Israeli threats to strike Iranian nuclear facilities.
Iran's foreign minister wrote on social media that a path to a deal is not, quote, rocket science. In his words, zero nuclear weapons equals we do have a deal. Zero enrichment equals we do not have a deal. The State Department says the U.S. position is that Iran should not be able to enrich uranium, and the White House has been warning Iran that this could end in two ways, a positive diplomatic solution or a, quote, very negative situation for Iran. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, the State Department.
There's been a mass attack in the German city of Hamburg. Police say a suspect stabbed multiple people at the city's central railway station. They say 12 individuals were injured, several of them critically. No details on the suspect, though. However, police posted on the social media platform X that a person has been arrested. At last check on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was down 145 points at 41,710. The S&P is down 26. The Nasdaq is off 147. This is NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning with our top stories. Seattle police have arrested 3 men in their investigation into last Saturday's fatal shooting in Pioneer Square that left 3 people dead. SPD says homicide detectives and a SWAT team arrested 3 suspects last night in South Seattle. Police say they also searched an apartment during the arrests and recovered several firearms. But they say it's not yet known if those weapons were used in last weekend's shootings. 2 suspects have been booked into King County Jail for investigation of murder and assault. They're scheduled to have their first court appearance this afternoon. The 3rd suspect has been booked for a state corrections department escape warrant. Planned Parenthood in Washington says the budget recently signed by Governor Bob Ferguson cuts $8.5 million to a program meant to protect access to affordable reproductive health care. More on what that means from KNKX reporter Freddie Mansanarez.
The cut to a program called the Abortion Access Project represents 55% of its funding. The program distributes money to 5 organizations that operate 34 clinics across the state. Courtney Norman is Planned Parenthood's Washington state director.
I think it does harm our state's, reputation as being a leader, if not the leader, nationwide in protecting and enshrining abortion rights. Because what do those rights mean if we don't really have access for the most vulnerable in our state?
The state funding cut could mean reduced hours and staffing at clinics. Some clinics may be forced to close altogether. Meanwhile, providers in Washington continue to see patients from other states where abortion has been restricted, such as Idaho. In Seattle, I'm Freddie Mansanarez.
People and pets are now being told to stay out of the water at 3 local parks ahead of the long Memorial Day weekend. Cottage Lake in Woodinville is dealing with toxic algae, and Juanita Beach in Kirkland and Jean Coulon Beach in Renton have high levels of bacteria. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Capital One with the Capital One Saver Card. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Details at CapitalOne.com. And the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to Week in Review. I'm Gabriel Spitzer, sitting in for Bill Radke this week. We get together every Friday and try and make some sense of the week's news, process things together with a bunch of nice people. That includes this week Seattle political and public affairs consultant and 1/3 of the Seattle Nice podcast, Sandeep Kaushik. Welcome, Sandeep. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
Opportunity Institute Communications Director Alexis Mansanarez. Welcome to Week in Review for the second time, right, Alexis?
Yes. Thank you for having me back.
Our pleasure. And Seattle Times City Hall reporter and co-host of the Seattle News, Views, and Brews podcast, David Kroman. Hey, David.
Hello.
I think we're missing some brews on this Week in Review. But I want to thank everyone for joining us on the radio, on the podcast, and on YouTube, where we stream this thing live. Just go to YouTube and search for KUOW Week in Review if you want to see our smiling faces. So turning to our big stories of the week. We learned this week what our state budget is going to look like next year, and maybe how much we're going to be paying for taxes at the gas pump and at the till. Did we learn something about our newish governor? Bob Ferguson signed the $78 billion two-year operating budget and mostly kept his veto pen in its holster. That means approving about $9 billion in new revenue over 4 years, which is what observers say is the largest tax hike in state history. So, Sandeep, this was a governor who spent most of the session shooting down new tax ideas and pushing a cuts-first approach to closing the budget deficit. Were you surprised that he just went ahead and signed off on all the new revenue?
A little bit. I was a little bit surprised. There was definitely some suspense about what he was going to do with the final package that the legislature passed.
He was very tight-lipped about it.
He was very tight-lipped about it right up until the day, that the last Tuesday when he made the when he actually signed off. I would say this, there was certainly a lot of pressure brought to bear on him by business and other folks saying, hey, some of these taxes are ill-conceived or too big. That said, it was very clear, I think, from those of us who were watching that the governor did not want to do something that would precipitate him having to call a special session. And the way that budget was written, he can't do line item vetoes. He's got to veto sections of the budget. And in order for him to get at, for instance, the sales tax on services is one of the more controversial and contested taxes that appeared very late in the process. Some people are saying it wasn't cooked correctly. There are some unintended consequences of it. For him to get at that, he would have had to veto a section of the budget that would have led to like $2 billion in budget cuts, and that would have required a special session.
What's wrong with a special session?
It would be, well,
sounds fun to me.
Given how contentious the regular session was, as Gabriel, as you were pointing out, the governor and particularly progressives, but Democratic leadership in both caucuses there was a lot of blood on the floor in those conversations. And while $9 billion is the biggest tax increase in a while, it's a lot smaller than where the caucuses wanted to go, right? They wanted to go kind of more than twice as big as that in terms of taxes. So I think in the interest of intra-party harmony and, those sorts of things, and because it would have required a special session that could have gone God knows where, the governor, I think, ended up signing off on the package.
Yeah. Alexis, what did you take away from this? Were you waiting with bated breath to see what governor was going to do?
Oh, boy. Yes. As y'all mentioned, he was keeping us all on our toes as to whether he would sign or bring folks back. I do want to be clear, the tax increases proposed are going to fall largely on everyday Washingtonians and working folks. What the legislature did this year was put forth a historic revenue package that would have attempted to begin to fix our upside down tax code. We're 49th out of 50th for most regressive tax code. And for Boeing to continue to get these carve outs, for big businesses to continue to get these carve outs and taxes be passed on to working people, it just calls to question what Bob's priorities are. He, very quickly abandoned a large part of the base that got him elected. We had labor doing sit-ins in his office. So, who does Bob want to be? And I think we got a clear picture of some of his priorities are not with the working people like they said they were.
But do you think they would have been any happier if we had wound up with a budget that relied almost completely on cost cutting in order to balance the budget?
Who would have been happier? I'm sorry.
The workers, the constituents.
Well, no, I mean, we shouldn't be taking austerity budget measures, and we should be, right sizing our tax code, calling on ultra wealthy big businesses to pay what they actually owe instead of working people and everyday Washingtonians.
Yeah. David, what does this say about what kind of governor Bob Ferguson is shaping up to be? How does he govern? Is he pragmatic? Is he enigmatic? How do you size him up at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my beat, so I'm not on it every day. But my sense is there's kind of two ways of trying to interpret who Governor Bob Ferguson is. It's either, because he came out of the gate and he was really speaking a language that Republicans liked in his initial speeches. He talked about combing through the budget, and he pretty quickly rejected the idea of a wealth tax. And so then there became this question of like, is this who Governor Bob Ferguson is, or is he, is this the chess master Bob Ferguson that he's kind of offering these perceived early concessions so that he can,
he's really thinking several moves ahead.
Go back to being the liberal governor that everyone expects him to be, and so, and from my perspective, I don't know that I know the answer to that. And I think that was sort of the defining theme of this session is who is this new governor? I part of his tenure was his first session was kind of defined by his predecessor in former Governor Jay Inslee, because he was the one who proposed a wealth tax to close this budget deficit. So it kind of forced the issue onto Ferguson right away. I think it probably would have been anyway, because the legislative Democrats were eager to have that conversation. But I come away with it. I still don't have a super clear sense of exactly the kind of governor he wants to be.
Yeah. But we're also learning more about what kind of legislature we've got. I mean, you made the point that the legislature seems to be to the left of the Seattle City Council these days.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot more of them than there are on the Seattle City Council. So there's some nuance to that statement. But as far as kind of the things they are talking about and considering, of course, the state has a lot more authority on taxation than Seattle does, so they can have these conversations in the first place. But the conversation about a capital gains tax in Seattle, for example, came up briefly last year and then was voted down, hasn't really come up again. And so, I think when we're talking about particularly, what sort of taxation we're tapping into to close deficits and things like that, it just feels like the conversation happening in the state is much more of kind of a left-wing conversation. That's what's happening in City Hall, which anybody who's been watching City Hall for the last 10 to 15 years, that is a pretty dramatic shift.
Yeah, if I can jump in. I mean, what's happened in Olympia is that basically the Republican Party, as a viable party contesting for majority status in Washington State, has essentially collapsed. They've turned into a MAGA clown car, right? And so they can't really compete anymore in they're not even remotely in the game in terms of like actually fighting for majority status. Democrats have essential supermajorities in both houses. So the real fights are within the Democratic Party. They are intra-party fights. So it's Governor Bob Ferguson taking one kind of Democratic Party position against sort of progressives in the legislature who want something different, right? And that's sort of how those kind of fights play out. But with these increasing Democratic majorities, you have seen the caucuses not just grow, but become a deeper shade of blue, right? And so that's why I do think in Olympia, there's a kind of very emboldened progressive caucuses, right, in both houses. And that was sort of the impetus for, I think, some of the debates that we just had within the caucuses and between the governor, particularly in the caucuses.
And I actually think an underrated part leading into the session was the failure of the capital gains repeal initiative. There was this proposal to roll back the capital gains tax, and it lost pretty handily.
A ballot initiative.
In 32 out of 39 counties.
In 32 out of 39.
I did that campaign.
Right. There you go. I think a lot of Democrats took away from that of like, we don't pay a political price for talking about taxes on rich people. And I think that was taken pretty to heart. And that's why we had a lot of these conversations around wealth taxes and, the how the Washington's code is constructed. It's just so turned out that Governor Ferguson was wanted to have a different conversation.
Yeah, I will say, with EOI's work in the progressive revenue space, 5 years ago when staff was talking about a wealth tax, they were effectively getting laughed out of rooms and not taken seriously. Public sentiment, mandates from voters in both the November election and Seattle's special election in February, using progressive revenue to fund things like social housing. This is very popular. It's, wealth tax is a pragmatic approach to fix our revenue issue. It's not a spending issue. It's a revenue issue. We have wealth in Washington. We have multi-million and billionaires. We have some of the world's largest corporations, and they're not paying what they owe. And now the public is well aware and behind that, and lawmakers are kind of taking that to heart.
All right. Well, let's pull back a little bit from the State House here and turn our focus to City Hall for a little bit, because we've had some telling developments in Seattle city government this week, including some election maneuvering as Mayor Bruce Harrell gets ready to run again. This week he got a high-profile endorsement. David, we're in your wheelhouse now. Who jumped on the Bruce bandwagon this week?
Well, I don't know that it was just this week. I think slowly, I've been sort of watching this and writing about it occasionally for a while, but I think labor has been kind of slowly jumping on to the Bruce Harrell bandwagon over the last year plus, really, which is notable because he had some labor support, particularly from kind of building and construction trades in 2021. But his opponent, then Councilmember Lorena Gonzalez, kind of cleaned up the majority of the labor support, including from MLK Labor, which is this council. It's basically a union of unions. 150 unions participate in this council. That has been shifting. I've had talked to unions who endorsed Gonzalez in 2021, who have since endorsed Harrell this year, even before this most recent vote. And so this last week, the Labor Council, which threw its support behind Gonzalez last time, endorsed Harrell for re-election. And this body is not some super left-wing organization. They endorsed Jenny Durkin. They have shown a willingness to kind of endorse perhaps more moderate candidates, but I think it's the shift from 4 years ago that they have essentially changed their mind. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them, I think, the kind of most craven rationale is perhaps they just think he's going to win, and it's the easiest thing to do is to back the person you think is going to win. But I think he has done several things that have emboldened labor to him. He passed a couple of tax levies that will see big construction contracts to building and trades workers. He blocked some changes to some of the city's wage laws. He gave the city unions a really, really favorable contract at a time when a lot of unions were not getting favorable contracts. So I think all of that taken together has put Harrell in a position where he is putting together the kind of coalition that a lot of people think is needed to win elections in Seattle, which is he's got backing from business, he's got backing from labor. We can talk about a poll that came out this week that shows that it might actually be a fairly close race, but in the sort of traditional expectation of what happens in city government, he is taking the sort of steps that perhaps a political consultant like Sandeep might advise him to take.
Yeah, let's come back around to that poll in a moment. But Sandeep, I am curious how you read this endorsement. Does Labor believe that Bruce is their guy, or is this a pragmatic thing?
I think Labor believes that he's a guy that they can work with, right, and that he's not gonna buck them on their main priorities, right? And so I do think he's made a lot of headway with progressive labor, right? But the real issue for the MLK endorsement, right? A couple of things. One, some of the biggest, most deep-pocketed, farthest left unions abstained in that vote, right?
Yeah.
UFCW stayed on the sideline.
Right.
And the reason that jumps out to me is those are the unions that fund the big independent expenditure campaigns and mayoral races. In the last race that Bruce won in 2021, the IE for Lorena Gonzalez spent like $1.3 million. Almost all of that was like progressive labor money, right?
Unite Here and UFCW.
Yeah, Unite Here and UFCW put most of the money in there. So if even they are kind of like we're not going to affirmatively endorse Bruce, but we're gonna abstain and stay on the sidelines. That's really significant because if the money doesn't flow, it costs a lot of money. I've done a bunch of mayor's races. It costs a lot of money to win a mayor's race, particularly outside money because of the way I would say some dumb ways that our campaign finance laws are set up in Washington State. That's really significant, right? So it's a signal that the money is not going to flow to the left lane challenger against Bruce, right?
Got it. Okay. Alexis, what do you make of this? And do union endorsements still matter?
Yes. In a political climate that is, has two big kind of arms, big business and labor, a diverse form of labor. I think unions, do matter a lot. And I just question, what Bruce did to earn MLK Labor's endorsement. Sure, David, you named off a bunch of things, but he also is the one who told city workers to rally their butts off. I don't know if I can say the other word live on air. And when he lowballed them on raises, he was all over Amazon's anti-social housing initiative mailers. And he's done Chamber of Commerce's bidding and rated affordable housing funding to avoid taxing the rich. So there's just this, I just am curious as to why MLK Labor decided to take this route and sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, okay, if they think Harold's going to win and they back him, why don't they back a challenger, a viable challenger, as we'll talk about in a second, and Katie Wilson, who would be a strong labor partner, who is a strong labor partner. It's just not great.
Well, say more about that. Let's talk about Katie Wilson for a moment, a challenger. Who is Katie Wilson, and what makes you say that she is a potentially viable rival?
Katie Wilson is executive secretary of Transit Riders Union, running, of course, as probably, I don't know, Sandeep, what your opinion is, but I would say like the most viable challenger to Bruce. Northwest Progressive Institute just released a poll yesterday that, we can talk about the logistics of. But what I took away from it was that when people were presented with messaging from both campaigns, 2-1, they picked Wilson, which shows that folks aren't happy with Harold's leadership and shows that, Wilson's priorities and her path to get there is getting buy-in from the public.
Mm-hmm. Just first of all, David sort of alluded to this point or made this point. Part of the reason I think labor has been lining up behind Bruce is this sort of sense of inevitability that he's going to win, right? So the extent that there's polling data out there that sort of pulls that into question, that could start changing the equation for some of the progressive money in the city, some of the left lane money in the city. It could start to maybe flow to a candidate like Katie Wilson. I do think we should not discount the fact that a former mayoral candidate from way back in my past, Joe Mallahan, has gotten in the race. And the last time he ran for mayor, he made it through the primary and lost to Mike McGinn in 2009. But he had written a big check to his own campaign that time. And he's a former T-Mobile executive, therefore probably is in a position to write another check to his campaign. We'll see whether he does, but he could end up being viable here. But yeah, I do think I would take this poll result with a big grain of salt, but I would also say, it's indicative that maybe the mayor isn't, his favorability numbers aren't as formidable as they were maybe even a year or 6 months ago, and that makes it more of a race.
Yeah, well, his favorability is decreasing. Northwest Progressive Institute did another poll in February that showed his approval rating was 38%, and in this poll it was 37. So I mean,
Trumpian approval.
I will just say I've seen private polling that has it higher than that, but I would still say not as high as it was a year ago, right? And so,
right, yeah, I don't know what to make of this as far as what it means for Katie Wilson. I will say it. Yeah, the numbers aren't great for Bruce Harrell. Yeah. To Alexis's point, his favorabilities don't look particularly good, and like at this point, he should. It's a mayor. It's not a president. People aren't going to have as fully formed opinions about him. But he has been mayor for 2, 3, almost 4 years at this point. He was a city council person for many years before that. This is a person who has been in city government for a very long time. And so, on the first round, when they asked people, what do you make of Bruce Harrell, or who would you want to vote for? 56% said they were unsure. That's a really big number, which doesn't tell me a lot about the state of the race in particular, but it does tell me that people are not immediately saying yes or no to yes to Bruce Harrell.
Yeah,
so the big question is, do those people come November say, you know what, good enough, fine, I'll vote for him, or do they get enough reason to break for a candidate against him?
One thing I will say about Katie Wilson is a very bright, smart, left, a left progressive thinker, policy thinker, and a credible mayoral candidate. That said, she's also got a ton of what I would call political baggage from the sort of 2020 era, where she was on board with stuff like defunding the police and stuff like that. And I thought it was very telling when this poll result came out and the media asked the mayor's campaign, what about this poll result? The first thing they put out a statement saying, this poll shows that she's drawing support from kind of more moderate and conservative voters who clearly don't know that blah, blah, blah. And they start just immediately hammering her on, she was there to defund the police and stuff like that. And I do think that that is real baggage for her. And if I was doing the mayor's campaign, I would be doing the same thing. I would kind of go right at that stuff.
Telegraphing the fault lines.
Because I'm sorry, but the sun has set on that world for the progressive left. And that's why they lost the last 2 election cycles in Seattle, because of being associated with some of those now kind of quite unpopular positions.
Perhaps some analysis. Perhaps some analysis for another conversation.
Yeah, just to make it clear, Seattle PD was never defunded, and Harrell has his own levels of political baggage. So yeah,
we all have baggage, don't we? Well,
but Katie called for it, right? That's the issue that they're going to make of that she was there, kind of manning the barricade, saying we should do this, right? And so that I will just say that's just politically a problem for her.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's scooch on to another piece of city business. The mayor came out in opposition this week to a move that Seattle City Council made to advance a measure that would change the ethics rules around when council members have to recuse themselves over conflicts of interest. There are plenty of watchdog types and good government folks who are not happy with this change. They say it would let members basically steer policy in ways that would benefit them personally. But it's not just a power move to kneecap the ethics office, right? In fact, this proposal came from the ethics office himself. I mean, David, could you remind us how we wound up where we are here?
Yeah, so the change itself is fairly simple, which is the current code says if you have a financial interest in a vote, you have to recuse yourself. The proposed change is you don't have to recuse yourself. You just have to make a public disclosure about it. The pitch, as you mentioned, came from Wayne Barnett, the executive director of the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission. And his thing was a few, which is he says, and he didn't used to be in favor of this change, but he says he's decided this is the right thing to do because, first of all, we now live in a district election system. So rather than having 9 direct representatives that you voted for, you now really have 3. You have 1 district person and 2 citywide representatives. So if somebody is not allowed to vote, then you've lost a third of your representation, is what he argues. Some people dispute that logic. And then the other piece is, I think over the last year, there were several high profile bills, both related to wages, one for app-based delivery drivers, the other for small businesses more broadly, that got derailed in part because 1 or more council people were not going to be allowed to vote on them. Former council member Tanya Wu in particular, her family owns a restaurant. So on both of those, she was seen to have a conflict of interest and had to recuse. And he felt like he was getting too intimately involved in the process, that he didn't think this unelected commission should be having that level of influence on a piece of legislation. And
basically a decisive influence, on very controversial questions.
So he recommended this change. The thing is, it until this last year, it hadn't actually come up all that often. And of course, now the headline is the city council wants to make it easier to vote on things that they have a financial interest in. On a broader level, and it's sort of fitting into a larger debate around what's going to come next. It's less about the ethics bill as it is right now, although some people, of course, have an issue with that. It's more the perception that they are doing this as a precursor to make changes to things like landlord-tenant regulation.
Say more. Yeah, I was wondering if there are particular bills that are coming down the pike where this could be a pivotal difference.
Yeah, so Councilmember Kathy Moore has long been working on this bill to rewrite some of the city's landlord-tenant regulations. Exactly how changes by the week, depending on who you ask. But I should say up front, a lot of those changes are being called for by nonprofit affordable housing developers because they're all having a really challenging financial time. Nonetheless, it's going to be a really politically intense debate if and when that bill does come out. And without changes to the ethics law, it's pretty likely that two council people would not be able to vote on it. Councilmember Maritza Rivera and Mark Solomon, both, they're not big landlords by any stretch. I think they both rent out a single property, but they are both landlords and they both get a little bit of income. And so under the current code, they would probably have to recuse themselves. And so if you're down, and also both of them, I think, are generally seen as Kathy Moore allies. And so if you're down those two people, the political path for a bill like that gets a lot more complicated. Kathy Moore denies that this is a precursor to that, but it's hard to see that there is not some connection.
Yeah. Alexis, what do you make of this? Is this nuance in an age of black and white, or is this, in fact, some political maneuvering that might have a more insidious sort of component?
I would say the latter. I think it's pretty clear that the majority of the city council is much more conservative than they might publicly admit that they are. And to, use language like increased transparency as, a way to have some sort of accountability, like that's just not how that works. If we look at this particular council, and this particular bill, when folks elected people to council, their finances weren't part of the campaign because there was this understanding that you would recuse yourself if there was any sort of financial gain coming from a vote. It just kind of upends and further sows distrust in a city council that's been very hostile to the public. And I, am in agreement with what has been said from, Dan Strauss and Alexis at the committee meeting yesterday, that, this is not a good pathway forward.
Yeah. Sandeep, is the problem mostly optics, or is it really a policy issue?
Yeah, I would say optics or politics, right? I mean, look, from a policy perspective, this kind of disclosure standard that, as we mentioned, Wayne Barnett, the head of the ethics department, is blessing and has pointed out that this is the standard that's quite common in a bunch of other cities and jurisdictions around the country. It's a viable standard. It's a perfectly reasonable standard. There are some real, I think, potential losses and negative consequences to having the current standard, right? And so there's a justification for it. That's one thing. That's the policy level. On the politics level, it looks bad. It looks like you're lowering standards, and
But you are lowering standards.
Right,
the standards are being lowered. The standards are lower.
Yeah, and maybe for good reason, right? And maybe because the higher standard is causing unintended consequences. I think that's the argument that's being, or negative consequences that we don't want. And on balance, this is a better standard to adopt, but it's still a perfectly reasonable one. And I think that is the case on the policy level. On the politics level, it doesn't look good. It's to your normie, I think, Seattle voter out there, it's like, oh yeah, they're getting rid of the ethics rules or whatever. And I thought the tell here was on the committee vote yesterday. It passed out of committee. On a 5-person committee, it passed 2-0 because 3 of the council members abstained, right? And I think they're abstaining because they are looking at the politics.
They're just trying to keep their heads down. Yeah. Well, speaking of the politics, I mean, that leaves openings for some of our more vocal opponents, including a familiar face in city council chambers. Former council member Shama Sawant has turned out and made this one of her more higher profile issues. I mean, what do you make of the return of Shama?
Well, she's definitely back, man. I mean, she's I think now 3 council hearings on this in a row. She's turned out with not the same size crowds that she used to be able to turn out of her.
Pretty big yesterday.
But with similar tactics, very disruptive, shouting at the council members, trying to disrupt the proceedings and stuff like that. And so, on the one hand, she's fired up about this issue. I think not so much because of which ethics standard we're going to have, but because of this renter protection stuff, she thinks that this is a precursor to rolling that stuff back, and so she wants to make an issue of it. But I've also seen her much more active on social media, attacking the mayor. I listened to her on a podcast attacking progressive Democrats like Teresa Mosqueda and Lorena Gonzalez and claiming they were taking credit for stuff she did. And so she's definitely kind of here and in play. And the way I read it from some of the comments she's made is that she very much regrets not her decision, which she says was not really her decision, but her political party's decision, Socialist Alternative political party at the time, not to run again in 2023. And that makes me think that maybe, in 2027 we're gonna see her make a play for council again. I don't know that, but certainly I'm willing to go out on a limb and speculate here that it looks like she wants to kind of be again back in the mix.
You think she's got some FOMO and wants back in?
That's right.
All right, fair enough. Well, I'm with Sandeep Kaushik, David Kroman, and Alexis Mansanarez here on Week in Review. Back in a minute, right here on KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. British naturalist Robert Macfarlane discusses his new book, Is a River Alive, with David B. Williams on Thursday, June 12th at 7 p.m. Tickets and details available at thirdplacebooks.com.
On the latest Sound Politics, it's an odd year election coming up, and something odd is happening. An unusual number of state legislative seats are up for election. We'll dive into what those races could tell us about voters' feelings on new taxes coming out of Olympia. Sound Politics, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Week in Review on KUOW. I'm Gabriel Spitzer, doing my best impression of Bill Radke. We are joined this week by Sandeep Kaushik, Alexis Mansanarez, and David Kroman. So, a bunch more local developments this week on the immigration front. Officers detained another green card holder at SeaTac Airport who was coming back from a family visit in the Philippines. ICE officers also detained several people at immigration court in Seattle where they were showing up for their hearings. And then we had another workplace raid, this one in Kent, at a specialty beverage maker where 17 people were arrested. Alexis, we keep hearing about these legal permanent residents being picked up, often based on very old and in some cases pretty minor legal infractions in their records. What do you make of these detentions, and how different is this from the status quo?
I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. Communities and families are being ripped apart. People are being disappeared, and folks are living in fear, not going to food bank to pick up groceries because they're afraid of getting kidnapped. Folks who the talking point is do it the right way and go to court and have these court proceedings. Their cases are getting dismissed, and then they're getting picked up by ICE immediately after, and who knows where they're going. So it's just really incredibly concerning. And I do want to say, and this is important for me to say, is the deportations that are happening aren't new. Under Obama's administration, more than 3 million people were detained. The escalation and the tactics and, this current administration's goal to act, just outside of the law in many cases to, kidnap and disappear people. It's just really frightening. And, if we do want to talk about status, coming after green card holders and legal residents, like it's just an escalation of, it really could be anybody in the future.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and reinforce what Alexis just said. Look, man, it's personal for me. I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. I was born in India. I did not become an American citizen until I decided to do so when I was 17 years old. So I had a green card growing up, right? And my understanding at the time was that I had every right that any other legal, lawful American citizen had at the time. That is the common understanding of what it is to be a permanent resident of the United States and to have that lawful status. And so for what the Trump administration is doing here really is, I think, an authoritarian and quite frightening overreach. And it's one thing to say we don't like illegal immigration and we're going to ramp up deportations of people who have broken the law by coming over the border. It's another thing to go after people who are here perfectly legally and going after them for either minor violations or sometimes for their speech, right? Because they wrote an op-ed about, their position on the war in Gaza, and they're going to like arrest, grab them on the street, arrest and jail them, and maybe send them off to some gulag in, El Salvador or whatever. I mean, that is, I'm just going to, it's fundamentally un-American. It's really, really wrong. It violates my own sort of sense of what we are like as a country. It's just, it's terrible. It's bad.
What do we think the significance of these arrests at the immigration court are? So these were immigration enforcement officers who were waiting for people who were coming to their scheduled hearings to be heard before the judge. These are people who are already in deportation proceedings. In some cases, the charges were just dismissed in the court, and the agents were then able to shackle folks and take them wherever they took them right on the spot. That seems to be also a bit of an escalation, something unusual. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I do think in talking, the language that this is un-American. America was founded on genocide, right? So the level of violence and harm is deeply American, I would argue. But it's just all, I don't know.
I don't know, man. Some of us had to beg to get in, man. So I'm just not. I find the kind of anti-Americanism of the left to be a little bit.
Well, it's not anti-Americanism. It's history. It's a fact. America was founded on genocide of indigenous communities. That's not un-American. It's history.
It's also not mutually exclusive, right? It was also founded on idealism and a lot of
taxing the rich.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But I will say, it's these eyes showing up in court, masks on their faces, not for any type of COVID or flu mitigation, but to conceal their identity in plain clothes, no type of disclosure. There's reports that like clerks don't even know who these people are, and they come in, the ICE agents come in and disappear folks. It's just, it's just deeply concerning.
Well, we are supposed to be a nation of laws. We're supposed to be a constitutional republic. Like the president is not a king. You don't get to just sort of willy-nilly sort of decide to disappear people and stuff like that. It is extremely concerning and an authoritarian overreach. Whatever we sort of think about the origins of the American Republic or whatever, right? But so yeah, I mean, yeah. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, David, I thought we were supposed to be a sanctuary jurisdiction, right? Why are these all happening?
Because sanctuary jurisdictions mean that local law enforcement doesn't cooperate, but there's very little that can be done if the federal law enforcement wants to act on their own. So it's in some ways in these kind of cases irrelevant what jurisdiction, because the federal government can do what it wants to do. I'll say that what stands out to me is these are lines that the first Trump administration did not want to cross. Well, I mean, actually, I won't say that. I don't know what they wanted to do. They perhaps wanted to cross them. They did not cross them. Courts and things like that, while not totally, there was some respect of, hey, if we do immigration enforcement in these sensitive places, that is going to be a net negative because people will not show up to their court hearings, will not seek out public services, whatever it is. We haven't mentioned the raid on the beverage company, arrested 17 people. Have not seen those kinds of just workplace raids. No indication that any of those people had any sort of egregious crime that they needed to be. It appears to be just because they didn't have.
The authorities talked about it being part of a criminal investigation. The alleged crime would have been on the part of the employers, who doesn't. At least we haven't been notified that they're being sanctioned. It's the workers.
It's the workers. And so all of this is are lines that were not crossed in even the first Trump administration that are now being crossed now. And, it is the dismissing of the deportation cases and then using this kind of backdoor approach, that is a new front. It is a rejection of the system that we've set up now without the approval of Congress.
Yeah. Well, our time is running short, so we're going to move on to what is, I think, some seemingly good news about the opioid epidemic in this case. Overdose deaths are down across the country. In Washington, they have dropped a little less than the national average, at about 12% in 2024 from the last year. That is still the biggest decrease in almost a decade. In King County, overdose deaths dropped by 22% after years and years of increases. So we're now back down to 2022 levels. Sandeep, how significant is this drop in overdose deaths in King County and Washington versus the country at large? And do you think that this is a blip, or is this a trend?
It's significant, I think, and welcome. I mean, obviously the context here is that fentanyl-related overdoses have been skyrocketing across the country and in Seattle and King County over recent years. So to see a double-digit drop, look, the national drop is bigger overall than it is here, but we're kind of in line with other West Coast jurisdictions in terms of the level of drop that we've seen. It's hard to know exactly why that's happening. Some of it is the much more widespread availability of overdose, Narcan. Narcan overdose recovery medications that are being very, very widely distributed by public health authorities. That's a really good thing to see. It's having an impact. It may be that the actual drug supply is not as the fentanyl is not as potent. There are any number of factors that are going in. There's also some just new treatment protocols. I'm on the board of the Downtown Emergency Service Center. There was a big Seattle Times story a couple of weeks ago about a really promising new medically assisted buprenorphine-related treatment protocol for fentanyl that is showing enormous improvement in getting people onto bupe and keeping them there, whereas fentanyl is a very difficult, it's not the same thing as heroin. It's a very difficult drug it has sort of different impacts and it's difficult to treat. So the fact that we're finally figuring out some ways to help people deal with their addiction issues is all really promising. But it's fragile. This is early stuff, and there's been some more recent data showing maybe a blip upwards in overdose deaths. So we're gonna have to wait and see how it all plays out. But there have been a lot of actions that have been taken. They seem to be showing some positive results, and we should encourage doing more of that.
Yeah, and I wonder, there's just a lot of cuts coming down the horizon to public health programs, both at the federal level and trickling down to the state and local levels. Does that put some of this progress in jeopardy, I wonder?
I'll dive in here. Yes, yes, it does. Look, Medicaid is the primary means by which service providers provide these sorts of sometimes quite costly medically assisted interventions for opioid addiction, right? And so, for instance, that program I just mentioned, the DSC, right? That the 30-day injection of Sublocade, which is a long release form of buprenorphine, that costs something like $1,700 a month. That is paid for hundreds of people that DSC is serving, homeless folks who are finally making progress in dealing with their fentanyl issue. That's all. Basically, what the Republicans in Congress did is they're putting a work requirement onto Medicaid, and so for very seriously impaired, mentally ill, addicted people on the streets who are finally getting help through Medicaid-funded, medically assisted treatment. That's all in jeopardy right now. It's terrible. It's going to be disastrous on the streets of blue cities like Seattle.
Wow. All right. Well, I am here with David Kroman, Sandeep Kaushik, and Alexis Mansanarez. We are talking about the week's news here in Week in Review. When we come back, we'll round up a few of the headlines we weren't able to get to in this level of depth. That's just ahead on KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
Wherever the day takes you, the new and improved KUOW mobile app is here to keep you company. Take us with you while running errands and never miss the sounds of home. The KUOW app makes it easy to stay informed and connected. Download the new and improved KUOW app now for iOS or Android.
Without getting sick.
Hey, welcome back to Week in Review on KUOW. I'm Gabriel Spitzer, sitting in for Bill Radke today. I'm here with Sandeep Kaushik, David Kroman, and Alexis Mansanarez. We're going to just tick down some of the stories that made news this week as well. Please feel free to pipe up if you feel inspired, but otherwise, no pressure. We'll just continue. Seattle police made some arrests in the triple homicide in Pioneer Square neighborhood over the weekend. 3 people were killed in that incident, and a 4th victim was taken to Harborview in serious condition. And then just a few days later, and a block or two away, another shooting killed 1 person, injured another. That suspect was also arrested because medics in the area witnessed the shooting, confronted the guy, and subdued him until police came, which takes quite a bit of courage. And just important to mention that in spite of this flare-up in violence, homicides are still down overall in Seattle as compared with recent years. And looking to the ways in which our local politics intersect with the national politics, our friend Joe Kent is in the news again. He is a Republican activist and former congressional candidate from Southwest Washington. These days, he's working for the Trump administration's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. This
Best
week,
and the brightest, right?
this week, it emerged that he demanded changes to an intelligence report on Venezuelan gangs and their relationship with the Venezuelan government because he felt that the intelligence assessment undermined President Trump's claims. So that's raised alarms about political interference into the intelligence work. He's also in line to become Trump's next head of counterterrorism. And of course, he popped up during Signalgate recently as well. I don't know, Sandeep.
He ran twice against Marie Gluckskamp Perez in Washington's 3rd congressional district, right? The former Republican Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler got bounced in the primary because she voted for impeachment by Joe Kent. And then it's really a Republican-leaning district, but Marie was able to win it and hold it in part because Joe is a very, I would say, extreme kind of MAGA, Trump acolyte. And so, it's kind of hearing what Joe's doing in D.C. now that they brought him over there after he lost these races is not particularly surprising to me.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder how the headlines will impact his job prospects down the line.
And I should say I had worked on Marie's first race, so I kind of dealt with Joe and that race. Yeah.
All right. Well, moving on, the city's only lot for people living in their vehicles is being forced to close to make way for a pickleball complex. This is in the Inner Bay neighborhood of Seattle. They say they're hoping to relocate somewhere else, but no word yet on where that would be. And that reminded me of another story that seems like it's ages ago, but it was technically this week. One of Seattle's sanctioned homeless encampments got caught up in a political vice over the weekend, as reported by our friend David Kroman. Tent City 4 had to make a rushed move in the rain to a new location because their invitation to the vacant Lake City Community Center was pulled back at the last minute and then reinstated. David, anything you want to add, takeaways from that reporting?
No, it's a little bit of a detente right now, but I mean, it's, neighborhood concerns pull a lot of weight in the city hall, and I think that's what we're witnessing. Also say with the RV, it's a being displaced for a pickleball court. It's a flashy sounding thing. When you talk, my colleague Greg Kim wrote that story. The people who are running that RV lot are actually quite appreciative to the people who are building the pickleball court, because it was always the plan to develop this area, and she had decided she would host this RV. So it doesn't sound like there's actually much bad blood between the RV lot inhabitants and the property owner, but it is just kind of too purely symbolic for RV homeless camp to be displaced by a pickleball court. But that was kind of the plan the whole time. It's some version of that.
Got it. All right. One more news story, my favorite one. A juvenile East African crowned crane has escaped from the Cougar Mountain Zoo in Issaquah, a zoo that I just learned existed a couple weeks ago when I was on a hike. The 2-foot-tall bird was later spotted at Lake Sammamish State Park, fraternizing with a bunch of great blue herons. These cranes have like a fan of gold feathers on the tops of their heads. It looks like a fright wig. You'll definitely know it if you see it. So zoo officials say the public should not approach the bird if you do see it. However, instead call zoo officials. All right. Wow. There's a whole bunch of news stories that we didn't even manage to get to, but want to make sure that we take some time this Friday, as we do every week, to reflect on something that made us smile. So just one of the ways that we can review keeps us sane and nurtures our better angels. So I will go first. For this week, for me, I'm a sucker for a good animal story, as you just heard from my crane advocacy. So there was a guy in Federal Way who fell asleep on his couch when a fire broke out in his bathroom. And before the flames could consume the whole house and this napping fellow along with him, a hero swooped in to save the day, Spike the Bearded Dragon. And he did exactly what they taught him in all those lizard fire drills, I assume. He scampered up onto the guy's sleeping face and whipped him with his tail until the guy woke up. And he was able to put the fire out, and the local fire department would later go on to honor Spike with a certificate and his own little firefighter's hat. So
we need a picture of that up somewhere.
I believe that the Federal Way Fire Department put it up on their Facebook page, so you could take a look there. And if it doesn't make you smile, I think you should consider some medication or something. Alexis, what made you smile this week?
Yeah, this is a preemptive smile. Seattle Storm, our fantastic multi-championship WNBA team, is having their home opener tonight. So I'll be going with a friend, and I'm very excited for the season ahead.
And for folks who aren't tuning in on YouTube to see us in what we actually look like, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I have a WNBA All-Star shirt from Phoenix on. I'm dripped out in WNBA gear today. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. David Kroman, what made you smile this week?
Well, I was coming in for the show this week. I live in Kitsap. I was on the ferry this morning, and the ferry stopped, and the engine shut off, and I wasn't sure why. And then I looked out, and there was a pod of orcas swimming by. And so it makes me smile that everyone on the ferry was enthusiastic about this orca spotting, even though it was probably going to make some of them late. I like that we live in a place where orcas take precedent over the speed of our ferry commutes.
We stop for orcas, right?
Yeah.
We stop traffic.
Yeah.
Excellent. Sandeep, how about you?
Yeah. So we were just talking about gun violence in Pioneer Square. My office is in Pioneer Square, and that's definitely a real problem. We had a bullet hole come through our conference room window a couple of weekends ago. So,
really?
yeah. It's not so at night on weekends in Pioneer Square. There's some bad stuff that's been happening. It's a real problem spot. That said, what made me smile? There are also good things happening in Pioneer Square. Just as the weather is turning. A new hotel opened up yesterday called Populous Seattle in Pioneer Square at First and King, and they have a rooftop bar, Gabriel. And I am proud to say that me and my coworker Folkman were the first people in there at 4 p.m. when they opened yesterday. I have a feeling I'm going to be spending a lot of time on that rooftop this summer.
And money.
Yeah, and money. It's a fancy, very lovely bar. So yes, it's a little bit on the pricey side.
Oh, that's great. What'd you have to drink?
I had a couple of bourbon. I drink bourbon, so I'm a bourbon on the rocks. So Makers.
All right. Well, I wish everyone some smiles this weekend, whether it's with the assistance of bourbon or not. I want to thank our panelists for joining us this week on Week in Review, including Economic Opportunity Institute that's a long title. Economic Opportunity Institute Communications Director Alexis Mansanarez. Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you.
Political and public affairs consultant in Seattle, 1/3 of the Seattle Nice podcast, Sandeep Kaushik. Thanks so much, Sandeep.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for coming back, David Kroman, Seattle Times City Hall reporter, who's also the co-host of News, Views, and Brews and Bourbon. I just added that podcast as well. Thank you, David Kroman.
Thanks for having me.
I also want to say thank you to our producer, Kevin Kniested, our board operator, Kathy Faulkner. We had social media help from Juan Pablo Chiquiza and additional support from Hans Tweit. I'm Gabriel Spitzer. Tune in next week for Week in Review. All right.
Support for KUOW's car donation program comes from local Kia dealers, presenting the Kia
Welcome
Niro.
to News Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm Rebecca Kesby. Today, stock markets fall in the US and Europe after President Trump threatens a new 50% tariff on goods from the EU. He's also got a message for Apple on iPhones.
I had an understanding